VLPSos here. This is a video lesson for Python programming for loops. These videos are made with the intention that they may be paused so that you can practice. For is a keyword to start a loop. I have two print lines here. In between, we're going to provide an example of a for loop. The print lines are so that when we see the output, we can see the beginning and the end of that process. For is a keyword that begins a loop. Count will be called the iterating variable of this loop. And I'm going to provide a list that the iterating variable will take the values of. The list elements are 1, 3, 4.5, and 10. This is the beginning of a loop. The code block that comes after the colon is the code that will be run once each time for every value of count, count being what we call the iterating variable. And count will take the values once, starting at the first element in the list and going through until the end and taking the final value, 10, which is the last value in the list. This code block will be used 4 times. Count will take those 4 values. And the code block will be simple. It'll print the value of count, which is going to change. We can see the output by saving and running. We see that the print line signifies the beginning of the for loop. The values 1, 3, 4.5, and 10 were printed in that order. And we saw the evidence of the iterating variable taking those values one at a time, and the code block being used 4 times. For loops are very useful. Here's a comment to remind us of the important vocabulary. In the code above, the iterating variable is count. Every for loop needs one. The iterating variable will be assigned a set of values one at a time from the provided list. The code block that is looped or iterated is indented under the keyword for. Let's give another example. And we will continue to contain our example in between print lines so that we can be clear which output belongs to which loop. In this example, we start a for loop with the keyword for. Next is the variable we call the iterating variable, and the list of values that the iterating variable will take is now going to be produced by the range function, range from -10 to 5 with a third argument of 2. In this case, the 2 is what we call a stride. Or a step. So we're going to produce, the range function is going to produce a list that will begin with -2, and it will go up to 5. It won't include 5. 5 is where that's going to signify the stopping point of this iteration. And the stride of 2 means that we're going to skip. So the next value after -10 will be -8 and then -6. The code block under the for loop will be simple. We'll print the iterating variable number. Saving and running, we can now see that the second for loop is in between the example 2. We start with a -10, we're skipping up, and we get to 4. Once we reach the end of our range, which is 5, it was a signal to stop the iteration. We never saw that the value of number got to be 5 or something past it. Comment? loop that iterates exactly 8 times and prints the iterating variable. We can see that we have 4 values that were printed, which means that this print line or the code block of this loop was used 8 times or iterated through 8 times. Another example. In this example, we're going to define a list first. A list of names, Hypatia, Archie, Bat, Mini Golf. These are names of a couple of cats and a couple of hamsters. We're going to iterate. Our iterating variable is name, and the list that will be iterated through is this list that we just defined, pets. Name will take every value in the list in order and run the code block indented under the for keyword for as many values as the iterating variable name takes. We'll print and we will use the iterating variable name in this sentence and then a print line to signify the end of this example. Notice that the print line example 2 end is not inside the code block of the for loop. Only the code block that is indented to be with the for loop will iterate or will run repetitively or be executed repetitively. And in this example, we can see that we iterated 4 times and the names that were in the list were used once each in the order in which they appeared in the list: Hypatia, Archie, Bat, Mini Golf. And some notes. A loop that iterates through a predefined list of strings, which is the example above, and uses the values in a formatted output. And let's proceed with another example. The fourth. In this case, I'll start a for loop with the iterating variable time. I will not prepare the list in advance. I'm going to supply the list that the iterating variable time takes the values of in the syntax of the for, and the code block will print hut, and then once the code block is ended and the for loop is concluded iterating, not inside the code block will be a print hike. And then another print line to signify the end of the example. Change that to a 3, which I should have done before, and that to a 4. Notice that in this recent example, number 4, that the code block of the for loop does not make use of the iterating variable time. It's simply a print statement. We don't need to take advantage of the iterating variable. In other words, we don't need to use the values that time will take. In this case, the for loop is simply being used to control the printing a certain amount of times. You can see when we save and run that we get the 5 prints of hut, and then finally when we end the for loop, then we're allowed to get to the print statement hike. In this example, the for loop was just to control how many times we wanted to print hut. The values of time and the variable time we did not use. It's not necessary to. And we make a note, a loop that iterates exactly 5 times, prints some output, but does not use the value of the iterating variable. And we'll proceed with another example. In this case, I'm going to define alph to be a string of the alphabet. And start a for loop that intends to use the iterating variable index as an index. The list that the iterating variable index will take the values from will be created by the range function. In this case, the range from 0 to the length of alph. So this is dynamic. I could change my string and this code would still work because I'm using the length function to determine how long my string is. And the code that we're going to run will print from the alph string with indexing brackets the integer that the indexing variable, the iterating variable index will take. The range function again produces a list of integers. So the iterating variable index will be those values of those integers, and it will be a data type integer. So when we use indexing brackets, the square brackets, and we supply that integer, then it is going to index alph, which means that it's going to choose to select a character at that location in the string alph and only print that single character. But the for loop is going to iterate through it, so we should see every single character presented. And we will not only print that character, but we're going to make it uppercase at the moment that it prints. And then a line outside the code block to signify the end of this process. We'll save and run and see what we get. We got the alphabet that has been made into uppercase, and it's been printed one character at a time. That is what the index does, is we iterate through all of the integer values from 0 to the length of that string alph. Now, if I wanted to print the alphabet on one line, then I could add to the print statement this end is equal to an empty string, which changes the end of the print string to not have a new line character at the end. It's replacing the new line character with nothing, or erasing the new line character. And the effect is that it doesn't go to a new line every time it iterates, every time it uses the print statement, and it allows all those characters to print lined up and recreate the alphabet, but this time uppercase. And if we're going to do that, we're going to need a new line character at the end to see that line separate. We make a note. The above, this iterates through a list of integers created by the range function and uses the integer to index a position within the alph string. And then there is a note on making use of this end equals an empty string. Note the use of the optional keyword argument end is equal to an empty string in the print function, which takes away the automatic new line at the end of a typical string print, which means the next thing that is printed starts at the end of the last print. And you get that effect. Now you. Create a list of strings that includes the name of some of your family, your friends and family. Write a for loop that prints a greeting to each one of them by printing the iterating variable. And this is like providing or creating your own example, like example 3 in this code. And then create a for loop that uses the same list of friends and family and produces the same output, but does so by iterating through a range of integers and uses the iterating variable to index the list, which is what we did in example 5.